Great Rising Grasshoppers. I am so glad that you are able to join me this last Wednesday of these recorded lessons. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter. I am a social studies teacher at Denton Magnet School of Technology. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to go ahead and wrap up this chapter of the Vietnam War years. We are going to be looking at section 3. Now, like I said last week, you may have wondered, why do we study history? We study history to learn the lessons from the past that explain the present and to prepare for the future. And that's a real simple answer on why we do look at history. So before we get into that, I don't know if you all can see this. This is an old wonky sweatshirt that I have had for years, and it says Kent State University alumni, established 1910, all right? Now, the word alumni means it is a group of people that graduated from a particular school or a university. Now, I got my first degree from Kent State University, so I'm a part of the Kent State University alumni. What does that have to do with anything? All right. The reason why I mention that is because at this school, something really, really awful happened in 1970 around this particular time that kind of galvanized people's opinion about the United States being over in Vietnam. If you listen, it will make sense. There's a method to my madness. You got to trust me. All right. Now, as always, if you do have the packet, make sure that you do have section 3, because we are about to wrap this up. And as always, if you just want to listen and catch this lesson later to make your notes, you can do that. Make sure that you go to the YouTube channel, MCPSS TV, to go ahead and get that. Now, you might notice on my screen, the question for today, you can answer it and submit your answer to MCPSS TV at mcpss.com for a Chick-fil-A t-shirt. And the question is this: who were the hawks and the doves? We talked about this last week, and if you are paying attention, you are going to hear the answer again. So be sure to submit your answer so that you can be in that drawing for that t-shirt. All right? Excuse me. Our 2 critical standards, like last week. Number 8, describe how the United States role in the Cold War influenced domestic and international events. And number 9, critique major social and cultural changes in the United States since World War II. So that's where we are with that. Let's get those dendrites going. Here's your bell ringer. If you were there, you are a high school student in 1969. That's 2 years after I was born. You do the math. You follow events in Vietnam very closely and often talk about the war with your friends. Some of your friends are active in the anti-war movement, but you also have friends who support the war. You think each group makes good points, but you are having a hard time deciding which position you support. Would you join the anti-war protests? Why or why not? I'll give you a minute or two to think about that. All right, you are in this unusual situation where you see the benefits and the not so good things about both sides. Here's the one thing that you do need to remember with anything that you do, whether it is participating in a protest or putting something on social media or even just stating your own opinion. You are free to say and do anything you want to, but you are not free from the consequences. So keep that in mind. All right, our key terms. First one, students for a democratic society. They are a student group active in protesting the Vietnam War, mainly college students. Hippies, people who dropped out of mainstream society and built a counterculture during the 1960s. Richard M. Nixon, and the M stands for Milhouse, FYI. Republican president elected in 1968. Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor to President Nixon. All right, our next set of key terms: Vietnamization, strategy of having the South Vietnamese army take over the fighting. 26th Amendment, constitutional amendment lowering the voting age to 18. War Powers Act, law passed in 1973 that requires congressional approval to commit troops to an armed struggle for more than 60 days. And the last one, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Granite Wall in Washington, D.C., listing the names of soldiers killed and missing in Vietnam. All right, so let's jump into this. Now, as the war progressed in Vietnam, more and more Americans, they began to criticize on whether or not the U.S. really even needs to be there. Is this really our fight? Do we honestly need to be there? So we have this division of the Hawks and the Doves. If you remember, the Hawks were people that were in favor of the war in Vietnam, and the Doves were the people that were not in favor of the war. If you remember, a hawk is generally a bird of prey, and a dove is a symbol of peace. So hence the name Hawks and Doves. All right, so one of the most active protest groups was Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and members of this particular group, they protested the draft as well as companies that supported it, that made products that supported the war effort in Vietnam. Anti-war protests were held at almost 75% of all American college campuses at this particular time. Some young men protested publicly by burning their draft cards. And others, they went to Canada. And they were sometimes called draft dodgers because they were trying to avoid being drafted. What does that mean to be drafted? It means that if you were a young man at that particular time, you could be summoned to join the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and go over to Vietnam. And some men were sort of like, well, that's just certain death. I don't want to do it. And so they would leave the country. That was one way that they avoided that. Many Americans, however, they did criticize the anti-war movement because they felt like, well, you're not American if you don't support this. All right. In 1970, for example, the thousands of construction workers marched in New York City shouting all the way with USA. They were supporting the war effort because their opinion was, if we do not contain communism, eventually it's going to come to our shores and then we got to deal with it. That was the opinion of the Hawks. The Doves, on the other hand, were like, this is not our fight. We need to go ahead and pull up out of there and take care of what's going on in our country. So you got both sides with valid points to this particular war. But one particular group who was, I would consider Doves, were what we call the hippies. Now, some young people chose to drop out of mainstream society, and they built this thing called a counterculture. A counterculture, a culture with its own values and its own ways of being. And members of this particular counterculture, called the hippies, they emphasize individual freedoms and nonviolence and communal sharing. Here's a fun fact. You know how sometimes words have many different meanings? In the medical field, hip would mean a body part. But later on in our pantheon of words, hip turned into a word that meant modern or with it or on point or, you know, you're not square. And from hip came the word hippies. So we have a lot of words in our language that morph into having multiple languages. So, and that came from the jazz era when it was hip to listen to all of this swinging music and things like that, and it just kind of carried over. FYI. All right, so hippies had expressed their rejection of traditional society by growing their hair long, wearing casual clothes, growing out beards, tie-dyes, very, very casual, very laid-back clothing. They did some other stuff too to show their disdain for what they considered mainstream culture. So commentators described this particular group, this particular thing called a generation gap. And what that was a division between the older and younger Americans. And sometimes we still have that going on. You might hear your grandparents say, well, in my day, we didn't have cartoons 24 hours. If you weren't up Saturday morning with your bowl of cold cereal, you missed it. That was it. You had to wait till the next week. That's my generation, by the way. Anyway, that's a sidebar. Moving on. So a lot of things were going on in our society in the late 1960s, and news of the Tet Offensive, and I talked about this last week, led to a sharp drop in the popularity of President Johnson. Now, real quick, if you remember the Tet Offensive, that was when North Vietnam had attacked the South Vietnamese on New Year's Day. Traditionally, as I had said last week, that was a holiday where everything was a ceasefire, but the North Vietnamese took advantage of that and went ahead and attacked. Now, after that, there were a lot of Americans like, I don't know if we need to be over there. So in early 1968, the percentage of Americans who had approved of Johnson's performance, it dropped from like 48 to 36. It wasn't looking good for President Johnson at the time. So as the 1968 presidential election approached, he was losing support within his own party. The Democratic Party was like, no, we can't get behind you. A whole lot of stuff has gone down. So as a result, on March 31st, he went on live television to tell Americans that he would not seek or accept the nomination of my party for another term as president. And so he exited stage left, went back to Texas, and retired on his ranch. Meanwhile, other candidates like Robert F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey were now vying for this spot. So things happened around this time. 68 was just a volatile year. On June 5th, 1968, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy, coincidentally the brother of President John F. Kennedy, he was mortally wounded at midnight at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. So he's now out of the race. Hubert Humphrey ended up winning the Democratic nomination for president, but the events at their particular Democratic National Convention, a whole lot of stuff was going on. There was protests outside of the convention, and it was just a volatile time, and it overshadowed what we were trying to do, what the people were trying to do at that time. All right. So as a result, the Democratic Party was divided, and a lot of times when that happens, the other candidate for the Republican Party won, which happened to be President Nixon. So he won. Now Nixon is in office. Okay, what are you going to do about Vietnam? Well, I want to go ahead and pull out our soldiers, but before I do that, I don't want this to be looked at as an American defeat. So what he ended up doing was this. He had a plan of what was called Vietnamization, and that basically was a plan to pull out the U.S. troops from Vietnam and have the South Vietnamese army take over all the fighting. Now, Henry Kissinger at the time was his security advisor and advising him to do these type of things. But what ended up happening was this. As he pulled the U.S. troops out of Vietnam, he also approved bombing raids on Cambodia and Laos to disrupt the supply lines. And so the American people were like, wait a minute, you want us out of there, but you're approving all of this. It's like you're saying one thing, but you're doing another. And so there was a whole bunch of confusion with that. And a lot of Americans were furious at that. And rather than seeking peace, they were thinking that he was expanding the war. And so there were a lot of student protests. Enter Kent State. So student protests erupted on hundreds of college campuses on May 4th, 1970. Well, let me back up just a little bit. If you are an alumni, it is part of your education at Kent State to know about the events on that particular day. On May 4th at Kent State University in Ohio, the National Guard was called in to break up a demonstration. And as a result of that, and a combination of sleep deprivation, a combination of mixed messages, a breakdown of communication, 4 students ended up being killed. Now, the interesting thing about that particular
I'm Ashley Rich, Mobile County District Attorney. The failure to obey school bus safety laws will cost you. It can cost you up to a $3,000 fine and the loss of your driving privileges.
But more than that, it could cost the life of a child. That's why the Mobile County Public School System is urging you to stop and obey all bus traffic laws. Hi, I'm Pat Mitchell, Director of Transportation for the Mobile County Public School System. We're asking you to obey all bus safety laws. It could save a life. Remember, stop ahead when you see red. Our future depends on it.
The Mobile County Public Schools Signature Academies program offers a variety of specialized curriculum for highly interested and motivated students. These academies provide students with choices ranging from aviation to healthcare, advanced information technology to international studies, from engineering to coastal studies. These high-quality hands-on programs prepare students for careers readily available in Mobile County. Signature Academies program.
Hey, welcome back, Grasshoppers. We had some technical difficulties, but I'm back. Let me pick up where I left off. I had said that during this time, a whole lot of student protests were happening on many different campuses. One of them was on my campus of Kent State University, and on May 4th, 1970, a tragic event happened. 4 students were killed in the crossfire between the National Guard and some student protesters. It was a combination of sleep deprivation, lack of communication, and just a whole melee of a whole bunch of, a whole lot of wrong, basically. The National Guard was not in riot gear. They had live ammo in their guns, which was not supposed to happen if you're trying to break up a riot. And if at most, maybe they should have had something like rubber bullets or what have you, but there was just a breakdown of communication all around. And as I had said before, the interesting thing about that is the 4 students that were killed, 2 of them were just trying to get to class, and they just got caught up in the crossfire, unfortunately. So that happened at Kent State. Some other things that were going on around the country that basically solidified people's opinion on we need to go ahead and pull out of Vietnam. No, we need to stay, was this thing called the Pentagon Papers. Now, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. was not being truthful about the progress of the war over the last few years. And so American people were like, now see, yeah, we need to go ahead and pull up out of there. Okay, that was the general opinion of many Americans at that time. So during this 1972 presidential race, the Democratic candidate, George McGovern, he had promised voters immediate U.S. troop withdrawal, immediate as in right now. And he hoped that the passage of the 26th Amendment would attract new voters. Now, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. Now let's get these map skills going real quick. Now this map does not have a compass rose on it. It shows the election of 1972. Now this was established in Article 2, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the Electoral College. The Electoral College, formal body which elects the president and the vice president of the United States, and each state has a certain number of electors based on the population, which is why the U.S. Census, you may have heard about this on TV, has been pushed a little bit. Now, according to this map, and according to our our key, Nixon is in red. He took pretty much all of the United States except for Massachusetts. All right, so now a whole lot of wrong went on during this time, but the Vietnam War finally ended on January 27th, 1973. The United States signed a ceasefire called the Paris Peace Accords, all right, with North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. And the United States agreed to withdraw all of its troops from Vietnam with this particular documentation. Fighting still kind of went on, and what ended up happening was what other leaders had said would happen with the domino theory. The communists took over Saigon and ended up unifying Vietnam under a communist government. And the United States, like many other immigrants before, would flee Vietnam and come over to the United States looking for a better life. Now, as a result, a lot of our Vietnam War vets, when they came back home, they weren't necessarily treated with the highest level of respect. That is a stain that I think that we need to recognize and correct. People were also no longer guaranteed to be supportive of the U.S. military going over into somebody else's country. Before this war, like with World War I, World War II, most of the American populace was on board. After that, they're kind of like, no, I don't think so. One of the reasons was because of technology, TV, all right? So many of the vets suffered from this thing called post-traumatic disorder, where they have flashbacks for traumatic experiences and things like that. But America tried to heal itself by erecting this Vietnam Veterans Memorial that is in Washington, D.C. As we speak. And it is a solid wall of granite, and it has the names of those missing in action or those who gave the ultimate sacrifice in this particular war. I am so glad we had this time together just to have a laugh or sing a song. And it seems like we just get started. Before you know it, before comes the time we got to say so long. Thank you for the honor and privilege of educating you. My name is Ma'ati Tanetter. I am at Denton Magnet School of Technology. Please be safe, my grasshoppers, and I hope that you have a wonderful and relaxing summer. Bye-bye.